The bell at All Souls tolls not with precision, but with memory. Its strokes fall like the last words of a forgetful man, hesitant, uneven, trailing slightly into the wet air before they remember their purpose and carry on. I used to think it a matter of poor maintenance. Lately, I wonder if the bell too has grown tired of perfect endings. I'd gone there, as I often did, not out of duty or even nostalgia, but for something more shapeless. A dull ache, perhaps. A desire to sit where the stone still remembered minds greater than mine, where footsteps once rehearsed, Latin declensions, and the air still held the thinnest trace of chalk dust and ambition. The leaves had begun their death. Ochre, bronze, a certain grey gold that exists only for a week in October, and the pavement was slick with them. I found my place on the low bench beneath the bell tower, lit a cigarette I didn't want, and watched the windows opposite turn slowly to fire and then ash. There was music once. A soprano in a narrow room, someone with a French name and hands that trembled slightly when she turned the pages. I cannot hear that music anymore, not truly. Only the outline remains, like light that still travels long after its source has died. The letter was waiting when I returned, slid under the door with the quiet courtesy of someone who believes that what is hidden should remain so. A single sheet, typed with fastidious indifference on old ribbon. No return address, no name, just the words. The door was locked from inside, but the key was never found. I read it once standing, then again seated, then a third time. Not for content, but cadence. Something about the phrasing, the rhythm, the small pride in its construction, reminded me of crossword clues, the ones that don't give themselves away unless you stop trying to solve them. I set it beside the ashtray and poured 2 fingers of scotch, though I hadn't meant to. There are moments, however infrequent, when even stubbornness accepts the invitation. The case it referred to had been closed as far as anyone official was concerned. A young man, tutor in literature at Wycherley Hall, which nobody speaks of unless compelled, had been found dead in his study. Locked from within, windows latched, note torn into symmetry. Tragedy without suspicion. The coroner had blinked twice, written the usual phrases, and moved on. But the letter had arrived, and that was enough. I tried to remember what I knew of the college. Wycherley. Narrow stone, soot darkened, hemmed in on 3 sides by larger, louder neighbors. A place of moth-bitten endowments and fine minds that had taken a wrong turn somewhere near the gates. I had known a man there once. Mathematics, I think, who insisted the college had no ghosts, only regrets. The bell tolled again. Once, then once more, as though unsure whether to continue. I left my glass untouched on the sill and walked to the window. Across the quad, the light in the music room flickered and died. Someone had been practicing too late, or perhaps remembering too long. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the second drawer of my desk. Beneath a newspaper clipping from 3 winters ago, a photograph of a woman on the steps of the Sheldonian, and a note in my own handwriting that read simply, "Ask Lewis about the dog." I no longer recall what that meant, but it felt unwise to throw away something I had once trusted myself to remember. Before bed, I attempted the crossword, times, naturally, and paused on 12 down. Reversal of closure, hidden in wine or whiskey, 7. I stared at it longer than was necessary. The answer, I thought, was unlocks, but I left it blank. Some truths, even when obvious, ask to be earned. Sleep came late, and not entirely. Somewhere between the second bell and the rain's slow percussion on the window, I saw the door in my dream. Narrow, painted green, scuffed near the base as if something had struggled to enter. The handle was brass, cool to the touch. I turned it. It resisted. When I woke, I knew I would go to Wycherley, not for justice, not even for truth, but because someone, somewhere, still cared enough to remember how a story should begin. With a question, and a door that never quite closed behind you. Wycherley Hall had the look of a place left out of time by mistake. Its stone walls too close to remember warmth, its windows too narrow to let in anything but diluted light. Even its name resisted memory. One doesn't say it aloud unless one must. Not out of disdain, but something gentler, more forgetful. Like a minor poet with one good line. The entrance bore no crest, no Latin, no bravado. Just a brass plate dulled by weather and indifference, and beneath it, the porter's lodge, dimly lit and over-furnished with the sort of practical clutter found in places that have stopped pretending to entertain guests. Fielding opened the window with the hesitance of a man startled more often than he ought to be. "Yes, Inspector?" "Yes, I remember. The letter, you said." I said little. I showed him the page without explanation, watched the way his eyes darted not to the sentence but to the corners of the paper. A man who notices edge more than content. He didn't ask who had sent it. That was the first thing I noticed. He led me up a staircase that groaned beneath its own history. The carpets bore a pattern that may once have resembled vines, or perhaps flames, now worn into abstraction, like a map to a country no longer taught in schools. Every fourth light flickered. Fielding apologized unnecessarily. "It's just ahead, sir. Dr. Rook's study. We've left it untouched. Out of, well..." He didn't finish the sentence, and I didn't help him. Grief should be allowed its silence. The corridor narrowed as we climbed. At the top, a door. Green painted, chipped near the edges. A brass bolt still fastened across the inside. Or rather, it had been. Now, it hung loose, unlatched, as if the effort of that final gesture had aged it somehow. Fielding hesitated with the key. "Old habit," he murmured. "Locked it even after." "Well, the constable said it wouldn't hurt." I nodded. We stepped inside. The room was not large. A desk by the window, its surface clean but for a half-burnt candle and an inkwell stained at the rim. Bookshelves heavy with theory and contradiction. A jacket slung over the back of a wooden chair, the gesture of someone who intended to return. And a faint smell of lavender and stale air, as though the room had been waiting for a season that never came. I walked slowly, letting the space speak in fragments. One book lay open on the windowsill. Hardy's poems of 1912 to 13, bookmarked at the Voice. A good poem to die beside if one must choose, but a romanticism that felt too deliberate, like the placing of flowers after the storm. I leaned toward the desk and ran a finger beneath the drawer's edge. Dust lifted easily. The drawer had not been opened in some time. Beneath it, I saw the edge of a scuff mark, dark against the wood. A boot dragged backward, perhaps. Not the mark of collapse, but of struggle. Or hesitation. Fielding cleared his throat. Said he'd never liked the top floor. Said Rook rarely came down for supper. Said the man had looked tired. When I asked what kind of tired, he faltered. "The kind that rehearses things," he muttered. "The kind that's always writing a speech to no one in particular." The door itself interested me. Bolted, yes, but the wood around the lock bore small, almost imperceptible scratches. Not gouges, not forced entry, just wear, as if someone had practiced turning a key in that door more often than necessity required. A man doesn't lock himself in for no reason, and when he does, the reason is rarely the one given. I asked Fielding whether anyone else had keys. He shook his head too quickly. "Just Dr. Rook, sir. And myself, though I never went up unless summoned." I asked when he had last been summoned. He looked away, and then down at his shoes. Said it had been over a week, just before it happened. He left me alone for a time, and I stood by the desk, watching the way the window caught the last of the afternoon's color. It was not a room that spoke of despair. It was too still, too studied. Death had arrived here not with rage, but arrangement. I lit a cigarette and looked at the bolt again. A question lingered in its metal hush. If he locked the door from inside, who did he lock it against? I've never trusted rooms that smell too strongly of polish. They seem to mask things, or perhaps to mimic a clarity not genuinely earned. Margaret Rook's office, tucked away in one of the more austere courtyards of Wycherley's philosophy wing, was just such a room, tidy to the point of artifice. A single window let in a defiant shaft of cold sunlight, illuminating a desk that held only a fountain pen, a leather-bound notebook, and a teacup whose contents had long since cooled. She greeted me with a smile that arrived half a second too late and said she'd been expecting someone eventually. Her voice was slow and silver-edged, like the echo of a bell that never quite fully stopped ringing. "You've come about Simon." Of course, I wondered when someone would. I didn't ask how she knew. People always know. She gestured towards the armchair opposite her, though she didn't rise. I sat without speaking. "He was many things," she said, fingers resting lightly on the spine of her notebook. "Difficult, brilliant in a particular key. Vain, I think. But I suppose all of us in this town learn vanity early, don't we?" I asked when they had last spoken. "Months, perhaps more. I doubt either of us would have noticed if it had stretched to years. That sounds colder than I mean it to." She paused, watching me as one might examine a chess position mid-game. "You're not here for sentimental recollections, I imagine." I let the silence reply for me. She responded by lifting her cup, though she didn't drink. Her eyes were precise, sharp not in cruelty but in something quieter. The kind of woman who never wrote down what she didn't want read. He'd been rewriting old work, she said, digging through boxes, annotating essays he used to dismiss. I think he feared becoming irrelevant. She smiled faintly. Or worse, academic. I asked if he had seemed afraid. She looked down then, just briefly. Not afraid. Prepared, maybe, for something inevitable. I left her office with little more than I'd brought, except for a small, curling doubt in the corner of my mind. People who've stopped loving each other rarely speak in perfect past tense. Margaret Rook's words had been measured to the syllable, and yet, somewhere beneath the surface, I felt a splinter. Not grief, but unfinished grammar. Eleanor Vane, by contrast, met me in a room that had clearly never been intended for visitors. The college's upper reading annex, part library, part storage, was lined with old catalogues and the smell of time well spent but poorly managed. She stood when I arrived, her hands clasped tightly together like she'd rehearsed the pose in a mirror. She apologized before I'd said anything. "It's still so strange," she said, her voice fragile at the edges. "Simon and I weren't close, not recently. I mean, we worked in proximity, that's all, and I helped with the archive. Occasionally." She paused. "Often. He'd been looking for something. A manuscript, I think. Or a letter." Her sentences arrived as though on broken stone, each one tumbling after the next, adjusting itself mid-air. "He wasn't unkind," she added. "Just quiet. Not in a peaceful way. More like someone remembering a sound he could no longer quite hear. There was a moment when I almost asked about love, but thought better of it. Eleanor seemed like the sort who would take the question literally, then cry it, having done so. Instead, I asked if she remembered anything odd. A conversation, a phrase. She hesitated, tugged at a fraying thread on her sleeve, and said softly, "Simon always said books should be shelved by sorrow, not by subject." I didn't move, but the phrase echoed oddly in the room. It was not his phrase. Or rather, it was, but only just. The sentiment belonged to Forster, I thought, or someone adjacent. But Simon had adjusted it, gently, intentionally. A subtle misquotation which can mean only two things: carelessness or concealment. I made a note of nothing and thanked her. She looked relieved, then guilty for the relief. Back outside, the quad had darkened. A drizzle had begun to fall, thin and cold, the sort that seemed less like weather and more like an unspoken reprimand. Somewhere, a bell tolled once. Then again, with slight hesitation. Books shelved by sorrow, not by subject. I lit a cigarette beneath the arch and wondered, not for the first time, whether people knew when they were quoting ghosts. The older I get, the more I trust paper over people. Not for its truth. Paper lies as easily as lips do, but for its habit of leaving traces. Ink bleeds, margins bear fingerprints, and even the blank spaces can suggest what someone dared not write. I found the magazine in a wooden box beneath my bookshelf, between an old timetable for the 1975 Bach Festival and a letter I never sent to someone who once sang in a room above Turl Street. The paper had gone brittle. The staples rusted slightly at the spine. The Wisherley Quarterly Review, winter issue, a journal of the thoughtful, the unread, and the overly convinced. Simon Rook's essay sat halfway through, On the Mirror and the Trapdoor, a title that flirted with cleverness but held something more delicate beneath. I read it once, slowly, without underlining, then again, faster, as if trying to hear the rhythm of its mind rather than its message. It was, ostensibly, an analysis of the detective story as an exercise in self-deception, how the genre allows the reader to pretend they want the truth when what they desire is the comfort of resolution. But there were other lines. Slips of personal grammar. Phrases like, there are endings that disguise exits and the door's not always there to keep others out. He quoted Chesterton but left out the rejoinder. He named Poe but inverted the structure of the example. And midway through, a paragraph that lingered too long on the act of staging, not crime, but meaning, as if Rook had begun to suspect the curtain itself of watching him. I closed the magazine and placed it beside my glass. Suicides do not write essays, at least not in advance. I called Lewis, who was somewhere duller than he'd hoped to be. A traffic collision, I think, near Headington. I asked him if he could check the Bodleian records for the original draft of Rook's essay. I wanted the edits, the crossings out. Not the performance, but the rehearsals. He promised he'd go. I told him not to mention me. He laughed and said my name didn't open doors anymore anyway. I told him some doors aren't meant to open, then hung up. The sky outside had turned that blue iron shade peculiar to 5 o'clock in winter. I watched the roofs of Brasenose darken in stages. Lit a cigarette. Let it die in the ashtray. There was a comfort in doing nothing that looked like thinking. The phone rang just after 6. Lewis, quicker than I expected. His voice had that note he gets when something doesn't fit. Found it, he said. Sort of. The draft's missing, was logged out last week. I waited. Name in the ledger, Margaret Rook. I thanked him, then sat in the quiet a long while before pouring another half-glass. People don't often steal what they've written themselves, but then they also rarely borrow their own grief. I thought of Margaret, her precision, her refusal to ornament, the way she'd said Simon was prepared for something inevitable, not afraid, not desperate, prepared. But then again, she'd denied seeing the draft. The Bodleian doesn't make mistakes. Its clerks might, but not its ink. Still, something felt off. I pictured her at the long wooden table, the paper before her, the distant hush of Latin murmurs through the old walls. Did she read it and weep? Or read it and wonder what was left unsaid? Or had someone else used her name? The more I circled it, the less the answer mattered. Whether she took the draft herself or someone signed for it in her name, the question was the same. What was in that essay that couldn't remain on paper? A single clue, perhaps, a name, or something less tangible. An apology smuggled in allegory, a confession made in metaphor. I wrote one word in my notebook and closed it. Trapdoor. Because mirrors, after all, merely show us the lie we can bear. It's the hidden exit we never find that undoes us. The seminar was held in a room that bore the smell of old chalk and soft failure. Third floor of Wycherley's northern wing. A place designed for small minds to argue about large ideas beneath flickering lights and flaking molding. The kind of room where the curtains were never fully drawn, but also never fully opened. A sort of architectural shrug. I arrived late, deliberately, and took a seat at the back. There were 7 others, 2 students still young enough to look surprised by language. A man in a mustard jumper who might have once published something on metaphysical syntax. And Eleanor Vane, though she slipped out before the questions began. The rest were ghosts in the shape of tenure. Dr. Julian Morland stood at the lectern as if it had been designed for him. Tall, broad across the chest, his beard trimmed too carefully to be casual. He gestured with the familiarity of someone accustomed to being heard, but not necessarily believed. The lecture was on literary paradoxes, the comfort of contradiction, the elegance of the unresolved. He quoted Barthes, Nabokov, even Beckett, though I doubt he liked any of them. When he mentioned Rook, it was only once and with a careful delicacy. Simon, poor man, always believed that doors mattered more than walls, that a well-chosen exit could redeem even the most unreadable plot. There was a small laugh from the front row. Morland let it sit in the air a moment too long before continuing. What struck me most was not the content, which wandered deliberately, like a man afraid of his own conclusion, but the tone. It was the tone of someone offering grief as theatre, with the lights turned low. No mention of the funeral, no tribute to Rook's work. Just that line, the exit. Afterward, I waited. People filtered out like steam from a kettle that had long since cooled. I approached the lectern slowly, with the air of a man who'd forgotten something he never really needed. Morland saw me and smiled with the wariness of someone who has already decided which parts of the truth are negotiable. "Inspector, yes?" I'd wondered when you might. I said nothing. He filled the silence with a shrug and a rhetorical sigh. Tragedy, of course, but hardly unexpected. Simon always rehearsed his endings, even in conversation. Left pauses like ellipses. His coat lay draped over a chair nearby. As he reached for it, I caught a glimpse. A corner of card tucked into the inner pocket. A postcard. The kind that doesn't travel, only lingers. Its image, a Venetian mask. Silver, locked at the mouth, shadowed around the eyes. I remembered it from the photo Lewis had shown me of Rook's study. The same mask, pinned above the desk. A quiet echo, or something more deliberate. Morland followed my gaze. Smiled again, thinner this time. We all studied the same tragedies, Inspector. Some of us just lived them longer. I asked if he and Rook had remained close. He paused, then let the question slip past him like a paper boat into the Cherwell. Close? Number not in any useful sense. But we shared the same ghosts. His fingers tapped twice on the edge of the lectern, a nervous habit or an old rhythm, and I noted absently that he wore no wedding band but had a faint indent where one might have sat. Rook had once been married. Margaret, a colleague, philosophy. I wondered how many Venn diagrams one could draw in Wycherley before the circles became meaningless. I left him there, surrounded by chairs that no longer held listeners. Back outside, the rain had begun again. A fine, almost intellectual drizzle. Not enough to soak, just enough to obscure. As I crossed the quad, I recalled something from Rook's essay, a line buried near the end. To vanish gracefully is the most underrated form of authorship. At the time, I'd thought it clever. Now it sounded like something written with more than ink. Masks, exits. The absence shaped like presence. I lit a cigarette and watched the windows of Wycherley darken one by one. Some men mourn by remembering, others by arranging their shadows. It's easy to believe Oxford holds its memory in stone. Those weather-bitten parapets, rain-stained cloisters, the endless faces of the past carved into chapel corners. But the truth is, memory here lies in catalogues, in ink, in the silent logic of the Bodleian's record-keeping, where even forgotten things are listed, numbered, archived. And so, when the Bodleian called to say the original draft of Rook's essay had vanished, I didn't feel surprise. Only the quiet confirmation of something I hadn't yet wanted to know. The checkout slip still existed, carefully filed, properly initialed, almost convincing. But the number didn't match Margaret Rook's library registration. A single digit was wrong. Not a careless one either. Transposed, intentionally. I looked at the line again, let it sit beneath my glass. Margaret, or someone wanting to be her. The handwriting was neat. That mattered. People who forge rarely trust their own hands. What worried me wasn't the theft. It was the precision. Because if someone had gone to the trouble of removing the draft, not the printed version, but the earliest form of it, then something had been buried there. Not facts, not names, necessarily, but tone, intent, the rhythm of a thought before it knows what it's pretending to say. That night I returned to Wycherley. It was just past 10, and Fielding had gone, his lodge darkened. I still had the key he'd lent me under the pretext of needing another look at the bolts. No one had asked for it back. I suspected they knew I would return. The staircase creaked in the same places, as if time hadn't moved since my last descent. The corridor at the top was darker than I remembered. One of the bulbs had gone. Rook's study smelled faintly of lavender and paper, as if someone had attempted to disguise a departure, and failed. The rain had left ghost tracks across the outer window pane. I stood for a moment, letting the silence reassemble. Then I crossed to the desk. It was locked again, but not properly. The mechanism had been forced at some point. Not with violence, but with enough pressure to damage the alignment. I opened it slowly. The drawer was mostly empty, except for a few envelopes and a folded sheet of blue graph paper. Odd, I thought. Rook didn't strike me as the mathematical type, but when I opened it, I saw the grids were not numbers, but letters. A crossword, half finished in pen. Two clues stood out. Both filled in, both boxed in faintly, as if he'd meant to come back to them. Each was a quotation, or at least an attempt at one. One across. I measured out my life in coffee spoons. Eliot. Except the spelling was off. Eliot double T. And the quote was from Prufrock. Yes, but it was not line 1 as the clue suggested. It came late, almost too late. 7 down. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Yeats. That one too had a small error. The line was correct, but the poem title scrawled above it was wrong. September 1916. The real poem was Easter 1916. 2 incorrect quotations. Both real, both altered slightly, not enough to seem accidental, just enough to suggest a message or a failing memory. But Rook didn't strike me as a man who forgot. He misquoted on purpose. I stared at the crossword longer than I needed to, then folded it gently, returned it to its drawer. The ink was fresh enough. A day, perhaps 2, before his death. The thing about clues is that people expect them to be helpful. I've learned to mistrust that. Sometimes the clue isn't what's there. It's the reason someone left it at all. A man like Rook didn't write crosswords casually. He selected quotes, weighed them, chose which truth to misspell, and always, always, for an audience. I stood at the window, watched the fog begin to roll in from the chair well. Wycherley slept behind me, old and unfinished. Someone had forged a name to retrieve an early draft. Someone had quoted poetry and done so just enough wrong to be remembered. But the real question was not who had altered the facts. It was, who had known Rook well enough to understand which version of the truth he would hide behind, and which version he might want someone, me, to find. It was Lewis who said it, though he didn't know what he was saying. We were speaking about something else entirely. A maintenance report, I think, or perhaps the missing archive ledger from the Bodleian, when he mentioned the fire door in passing. Offhand. Idle. The sort of remark one usually discards. They've painted it red, sir. Bright, too. Against regulations, apparently. And there it was. A door no one walks through unless they must, suddenly made visible. Not changed exactly. Just marked. I let the comment settle for an hour before I followed its direction. Wycherley's fire exit sat at the end of the corridor near Rook's rooms. Unused, technically sealed except in emergencies. But there it was, unmistakably red. Not the muted crimson of institutional oversight. This was deliberate, vivid, new. The university's fire code specified muted green. Regulations, like lies, reveal more in their contradictions. The corridor was quiet when I arrived. The light above the exit flickered as if reconsidering its usefulness. The door itself bore no scratches, no recent marks, only the freshly dried brush strokes of someone with a steady hand and a reason not to explain it. I knocked on the porter's window at dusk. Fielding answered a moment later, less wary now, but not freer. Said you'd be back. I asked about the door. He didn't flinch, which I noted, but his answer came too quickly. Bit of maintenance. They've been freshening things up. No, they hadn't. The rest of the corridor remained as neglected as memory itself. I asked again, slower this time. He hesitated, looked behind him, then back at me. It was Dr. Rook. He requested it, that the door be repainted, and that the keys be changed. Said it was about safety, fire drills, procedures. I asked when. 3 weeks before he... Fielding trailed off. And the keys, all remade. I delivered them myself. Every resident signed for their copy. Except Rook. No, he signed, but, well, he asked if anyone else would have them. I said no, of course not. Not unless someone had the old set still. But we collect those. Most of the time. There it was, a hesitation, barely audible. But it hung in the air like the final note of a song left unresolved. I thanked him. He didn't ask why. He knew better. That night I walked the length of Wycherley's inner court, tracing circles around its locked chapel, its shuttered library, its past. The air was sharp with the promise of frost. One of the windows above me flickered once, then dimmed. I found myself thinking of the three of them again. Margaret, Eleanor, Morland, each orbiting Rook like satellites around a dimming star. None claiming to have been close, and yet each lingering oddly in the light he left behind. Margaret with her precise silences, the way she said Simon rehearsed endings. Eleanor with her misquoted sorrow, her eyes darting toward exits she never used. And Morland, full of elegy, empty of grief, quoting Rook's exits with too much flourish, as if to convince himself he'd watched rather than participated. They circled each other. That much was clear, and somewhere in the center of that quiet constellation was something not quite said, not quite safe. Rook had changed the locks, not to keep others out, but to keep himself from being returned to something. An old ghost, perhaps, a betrayal not yet buried. The crossword flickered again in my mind. The wrong poet, the wrong war. A terrible beauty is born, yes, but some births come at the price of old disguises. Back at home, I opened my notebook, wrote one word, underlined it, then closed the book again. Read. Not danger, not love, not even warning. Sometimes red simply means look again. Memory in Oxford is often accidental. It hides in catalogues, slips between ledgers, lingers in dust. It rarely announces itself. More often, it waits quietly in the background of something else entirely. The archive room was colder than it had any right to be. Low shelves, grey light through high glass, the stale comfort of preservation. I had asked for staff photographs, nothing more. Just the annual portraits witchily kept in modest walnut frames and laminated binders, as if the weight of time could be managed by simple sequence. The one I wanted came easily. 1978, a strange year. Neither recent nor far enough to feel safely past. I turned the page expecting symmetry, but found something else. An awkwardness in the composition. The figures arranged stiffly outside the chapel, their robes creased, expressions half set. Rook stood to the left, younger then, jaw tighter, but already half vanished into himself. Beside him, Eleanor. Not yet the nervous librarian, but already leaning into shadow. What struck me wasn't their presence, but their direction. Neither looked at the camera. Their gazes shifted slightly to the right, toward something, or someone, just outside the frame. And in the far back, nearly lost in grain, a figure lingered. Not staff, not robed, barely distinguishable. A blur of dark hair, collar open, hands tucked behind. At first I thought it a photographic mistake, a ghost image. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. Someone had been there, someone they hadn't expected. I took the photo to Lewis. He was chewing something forgettable and said quietly, "Moorcroft. Felix Moorcroft. Expelled 1979. You ever come across the name?" I hadn't, which meant something. Wycherley forgets easily, but not completely. Lewis handed me a slim file, yellowed, sparse. Moorcroft had been a promising student, modern languages, a flair for the obscure, apparently. Then, a scandal, plagiarism. But the story was blurred. His thesis never made it to the examiners. Rumors circled. Someone else's work, accusations of theft, even whispers of faculty involvement. No charges filed, no names. Just a note in red ink, expelled without appeal. I stared at the photograph again. Moorcroft didn't look defiant. He looked removed, like someone who knew he'd been forgotten before the forgetting began. Later in my flat, I laid the photograph on the table beside the crossword, the draft record, the forged signature. The pieces were not aligned, not yet. But something old had been touched, and someone, maybe more than one, had reason to keep it buried. The thesis in question, Margaret's, had one distinction: a study of poetic ambiguity in Elizabethan court verse. I recalled her lecture tone, her fondness for paradox. But what if it wasn't entirely hers, or if, once, a student's draft had slipped too close to her own? It would have been easy to dismiss, a misunderstanding, a grey area, unless someone insisted otherwise. Moorcroft had vanished after expulsion. No record of employment, no forwarding address, no obituary, just silence, which in this city is rarely accidental. I returned to the study photograph once more. Rook and Eleanor both turned toward him, not startled, but expectant, as if his presence in the frame explained something they could no longer name. Rook had written of mirrors and trapdoors, of exits disguised as conclusions. What if his death was neither spontaneous nor singular, but a belated prologue to something buried decades deep? 3 people stood around a lie, and one of them had tried to end it. Perhaps too late. I made no calls that night. There are hours when even questions feel invasive. Instead, I poured a single whiskey and sat beside the photograph until the room turned gray. Sometimes, what haunts us isn't the thing we did. It's who watched us do it and didn't speak. It came, to me, not with triumph, but with the tired clarity that arrives when the mind stops trying too hard. The line had been wrong, delicately so, shelved by sorrow, not by subject. I'd carried it for days like a dull ache, knowing it didn't belong to Forster or Eliot or the easy shelf of remembered poets. It wasn't a common misquote or a clever rearrangement. It was something else. The college pamphlet had no index, just 30 pages of verse, printed on onion skin paper in 1977. An anniversary edition handed out at a reading no one now remembered. There it was on page 22, a sonnet without title, signed with an initial FM. In the 3rd stanza, a line, "Let them shelve us by sorrow, not by subject, we whose margins bled not ink, but omission." The line hadn't been misquoted, it had been remembered, and not from literary study, but from someone who had known the man who wrote it. Moorcroft hadn't vanished completely. Not from Eleanor. I found her in the upper reading room, sorting a pile of damaged returns. Her hands trembled slightly as she re-sleeved an old theology volume, the spine separating from its binding like a sigh. She didn't look up when I entered. She knew. I placed the pamphlet beside her gently, like setting down a letter from the dead. "You quoted him," I said. "Not Eliot. Moorcroft." Her fingers paused. One book slipped slightly in her arms. She spoke without turning. "He wrote it before they asked him to leave. No one read it. Not really. I always thought that made it more honest." I asked if she'd seen him again. She nodded. "Once. Then again. And again. He was sick," she said. "Coughing. Thin. Not cruel, but bitter, and so tired. He said he wanted the record set straight. About the thesis. About what was taken." I asked if he'd spoken to Rook. She didn't answer, but her breath caught, as if the air had betrayed her. "He came back, Inspector. I didn't know what he wanted at first. I thought maybe he wanted an apology. But then he asked for money. Names. He brought copies of Margaret's draft. His own pages. He said they'd laugh her out of tenure if the truth came out. But it wasn't about revenge. Not really. He just wanted someone to admit what had been done to him. And Simon? He panicked. Said it would destroy them all. He said, I remember this exactly, there are deaths worth more than reputations. I asked if Rook had planned to disappear. She nodded. Quietly. He wanted to stage it. Leave. Begin again. I told him it was mad. He said it was poetic. And the door? I helped him, just a little. I bolted it from the inside after he left through the stairwell. We'd loosened the lock beforehand. It wasn't hard, but something went wrong. She set the book down. I found him there the next morning. Still. No note. No bags. Just him. But the bolt had been forced. She looked up at me then, for the first time. Someone else had gone in. Someone who didn't come for answers. The red door, the altered keys, the stolen draft. She touched the edge of the pamphlet again, gently, like it hurt her. I asked why she hadn't said anything. She looked out the window. Because it never ends, Inspector. It just changes rooms. I left her there with the poem and the sorrow it refused to catalogue. Outside, the air had turned colder. A storm, or perhaps just November. Moorcroft hadn't killed Rook, but someone had. And someone else, perhaps 3 of them, had helped arrange the silence. It was no longer a question of who wanted him dead. But who could bear remembering that he'd once been alive? It was Lewis who found it. As always, half by accident and half by persistence. The wine cellar beneath Wycherley, locked for years, dusty, unused except for the memory of better funding and ceremonial port, had been mentioned once in a maintenance log from the 70s. Lewis had gone looking for blueprints and come back with a bottle, not a vintage, a hollow. Inside it a small brass key, dull with age but intact. The prints came back mixed, Eleanor's and Margaret's. Not unexpected, but not enough. What mattered was the dust, or rather its absence. The bottle had been placed recently, moved, wiped, repurposed, not for storage, but for burial. I sat with the key for some time, let its weight rest against my palm like a confession. It matched the old locks, of course. The fire door, the original set before Rook's request. Someone had held on to it. Someone who wasn't meant to. It wasn't Eleanor. She lacked the intent. And Margaret, for all her cold precision, would not have staged something so elaborate for so little reward. Morland, the man who wore grief like a coat too neatly pressed, who quoted Rook as if rehearsing lines, who kept a postcard of the same mask pinned above a dead man's desk. It was a performance. All of it, but not without skill. I went to him late. No warrant, no uniform, just a knock. He opened the door in a dressing gown, sleeves slightly frayed, the faint smell of soap and scotch drifting from the warm air behind him. Inspector. He nodded. I wondered how long it would take. There was no point in pretense. I stepped inside. A record was spinning softly in the corner. Mozart, I think, or perhaps something more wounded. The kind of aria that doesn't end, just fades. He poured 2 glasses. I accepted mine, untouched. You were always too clever by halves, he said, but not always for the right reasons. He sat, crossed one leg slowly over the other. Simon wanted to speak. That was the danger. Not to the police. He didn't have the courage for that. But to the world, a memoir, or something like it. The essay was just the beginning. You saw the draft, all those layered metaphors, trapdoors, reflections. He smiled. The man could barely tie his own tie, but give him a typewriter and he thought he was Euripides. I asked about the night. He didn't flinch. He rang me, said he was leaving, said it would be poetic. I knew what it meant. I still had the key. We all did once. He'd left the bolt prepared. Said Eleanor would finish the scene. But I arrived early. He was nervous, sweating, talking about Moorcroft, about guilt, about cleansing the record. I told him to burn it, to forget. He said it was too late. He paused, looked at the glass he hadn't yet touched. So I finished the story for him. Locked the door, took the long way out. Left you the letter because I knew you'd read it more carefully than the coroner. And the key? The wine cellar. An old hiding place. We used to drink down there once before everything cracked. He stood then, walked to the record player, lifted the arm. There was no resistance, no protest. Just a man watching his own curtain fall. The arrest was clean, quiet. Lewis handled the details. I handled the silence. Outside, the night had turned clear. The stars above the quad were sharper than they had any right to be. Rook was dead, but not in the way we thought. He had tried to vanish behind a page and been erased instead. It wasn't love that killed him, or revenge, just pride, the kind that stains slowly like old ink and never quite dries. There are certain benches in Oxford that keep their own memory, stone worn not by rain, but by the weight of thought, of waiting. I sat again beneath the All Souls bell tower, not for ceremony, not even for closure. Just to sit, just to hear the air without needing it to answer. The autumn had deepened, thin gold giving way to ash. The leaves had lost their edge, now scattered in pools along the edges of the quad like misplaced letters. The kind you find too late to reply. I hadn't touched the crossword. Not since the key. Some clues don't wish to be solved. Across the quad she emerged. Eleanor. Her coat buttoned unevenly, a book pressed gently against her chest like a memory being carried without permission. She moved without haste, without theatre. Her shoes whispered across the stones. She passed under the archway, didn't look my way at first. Then, halfway across, she glanced up. Her eyes found me. Not with surprise, not with apology, with something quieter. Her hand lifted, a gesture that wasn't quite a wave and not quite farewell. Then she turned again and was gone into the inner cloister. She had survived, but not without cost. None of them had. There is no triumph in endings like this. Only the faint ache of something that has returned to silence. A silence shaped like regret, but too well practiced to name itself aloud. I stayed seated long after she'd gone. Let the last of the day pool across the chapel glass. Watched the light fade from stone in slow stages. The poem returned to me, uninvited. Let them shelve us by sorrow, not by subject. It was Moorcroft's line, yes, but it might have belonged to any of them. Rook with his theatrical exits. Morland with his borrowed grief. Margaret, carefully, arranging her silences so they looked like dignity. Even Eleanor, whose sadness had not aged into bitterness, only into quiet. I thought again of the photograph, of the figure at the edge, of a face half seen and never quite forgotten. They had each carried a version of him, not Moorcroft as he was, but as he had become in their silence. A myth of guilt, a mirror none of them dared wipe clean. And Rook, Simon, he had tried to rewrite the ending. Not with honesty, perhaps, but with poetry. He'd chosen trapdoors over apologies, trusted metaphor over confession. The bolt had been tampered with, but not by Eleanor. The lock had turned, but not by chance. In the end, it was Morland's pride. Not rage, not jealousy, just pride. A final edit. I closed my eyes. Let the air shift. Somewhere behind me, the college doors closed, not with a bang, but with that soft, ecclesiastical hush peculiar to old wood. Then came the bell. Once, twice. A pause. Then again, and again. I stopped counting at 13. There are no superstitions I care for, but even now I hear that last toll differently. Not as omen, but as footnote, a final reminder that not every truth arrives on time. I rose slowly, left no mark where I'd been. Shelved by sorrow, I thought, and walked into the dark.